Under the midday glare, Elijah Kirby stood in the Chase Bank lobby clutching a battered canvas bag. A well-dressed couple nearby whispered behind their hands, eyes flitting from his threadbare coat to his weathered shoes. When he quietly approached the teller, the clerk's gaze hardened. With a single deliberate motion, she dropped his real ID onto the floor, not by accident, but as a statement, "You don't belong here." The ID's plastic clattered against the tile, echoing like a judge's gavel. No apology came, no second glance. A security guard smirked, stepping forward as if to usher him out. Yet Elijah didn't flinch. He bent at the waist, picked up the card with two calm fingers, and returned it to his pocket. In that heartbeat, every onlooker felt the sting of prejudice and witnessed the steel beneath his silence. If you've ever faced or witnessed injustice, share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and truth. The fluorescent lights hummed above as Elijah Kirby moved through the heart of the bank, like a ghost from another era. His steps were measured, no shuffle, no hesitation. Yet each click of his worn shoes against the marble floor left a faint echo in the silent hall. At the entrance, the automatic doors had barely finished sliding closed before a ripple of disapproval swept through the lobby. Well-dressed patrons shifted in their seats, tightening their grips on leather portfolios. A mother pulled her child a step closer. The security guard, Stephen Miller, leaned forward, as if expecting a fight. Instead, Elijah merely adjusted his canvas bag and advanced toward the teller line, his posture unassuming but unyielding. He arrived at the counter beneath the Chase emblem, its chrome letters gleaming like sentinels of privilege. The teller, a young woman named Megan, glanced up at him, eyes narrowing. "How can I help you?" she asked, voice polite but guarded. In response, Elijah produced an old laminated ID bearing his name in faded type, Elijah C.K. Kirby. It bore a gold star in the corner, certifying its authenticity. She took it in gloved hands, her lips curling into a practiced smile. Then without a word, she released the card, letting it drop to the pristine floor. Time seemed to pause. The card spun once, twice, then came to rest near the base of the counter. The patrons held their breath. The electricity of that single act crackled louder than the overhead lights. A pair of crisp high heels clicked forward as Elijah knelt. His fingers, lined with age and toil, closed gently around the ID. He rose, brushing dust from his coat, and returned the card to his pocket. No anger flashed across his face, only the calm reflection of a man who had seen far worse. A murmur coursed through the lobby, rippling down the rows of seating. Whispers of, "Who does he think he is?" and "Is he lost?" mingled with gasps of surprise. A wealthy-looking woman clutched her designer purse, casting him a sidelong glare. Even the bank manager, James Temp, peered out from behind his polished desk, eyebrows arched in curiosity. Yet Elijah did not waver. His dark eyes met Megan's for a single charged second, enough to speak volumes without uttering a word. Behind him, Stephen Miller straightened hands hovering at the holster of his uniform. The guard's bulk cast a shadow across the marble. He took a deliberate step forward, voice low and commanding. "Sir, you need to step aside. This is a private institution." Elijah inhaled as if drawing strength from the very walls. He turned the fabric of his coat, whispering against his pants. His voice, when it came, was soft, but carried through the hushed space. "Private," he repeated, but built on stolen promise. The words landed like stones on a still pond, sending concentric rings of unease through the lobby. Stephen sneered, but Elijah did not flinch. He reached into his bag and with quiet precision withdrew a brittle leather-bound ledger. The cover bore the words Chase Bank, 1948, in embossed gold leaf, now dulled by time. He set it on Megan's countertop, letting it thump softly against the formica. Patrons leaned forward, phones lifted in disbelief. The ledger sat open to reveal spidery handwriting entries dated more than 70 years ago, listing deposits, board resolutions, and beneath it a clear signature, Elijah C.K. Kirby. A startled hush fell. Eyes darted from the ledger to Elijah's face, where the lines of age seemed to sharpen with purpose. The bank manager, James Temp, now fully visible behind the counter, emerged. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, a stark contrast to Elijah's humble garb. Yet no amount of tailoring could mask the shock flickering behind Temp's blue eyes. He cleared his throat, voice brittle. I'm not sure what this means." Elijah's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. He lifted a bundle of faded currency next each bill stamped with an archaic Chase seal. They tumbled onto the counter, yellowed and crisp at the edges, a portrait of a hidden past in every crease. It means, Elijah said, voice measured, that this institution belongs to the man who built it with his blood, sweat, and vision. A gasp rose from the back row where a group of late-afternoon patrons whispered urgently. Nearby, the bank's young tellers exchanged stunned glances before one, the timid Emily Carter, stepped forward. In a single decisive motion, she bent and picked up one of the bills, placing it gently beside the ledger. One by one, others followed, employees and customers alike, each act a silent acknowledgement of the truth brewing in their midst. Stephen Miller's hand twitched toward his holster, but James Temp raised a gloved hand, urging calm. "Let him speak," the manager said, voice firm. "We will hear him out." Elijah nodded once, eyes glinting with quiet triumph. He stood tall amid the shifting crowd, ledger cradled in one arm, currency in the other. "I reclaimed what was mine," he proclaimed, "and now I ask only that you do the same with your judgment, your compassion, and your integrity." No one moved. The bank's high-backed chairs, the polished floors, even the humming lights seemed to lean in. In that soft, charged moment, the story of a silenced founder pierced the heart of skepticism, reminding every witness that true ownership is never just about property, but about justice reclaimed. And so beneath the chrome letters of Chase Bank, an old man's faith in truth rekindled the promise of a legacy nearly lost, and set the stage for history's next turn. The last echoes of laughter still floated in the high-ceilinged lobby when Elijah Kirby straightened his back beneath the Chase Bank sign. Every eye in the room, tellers perched behind their polished counters, customers cradling their smartphones. The hulking security guard, James Stephen Miller, flexing his gloved fingers, turned to him. The old man's voice, though soft, carried across the marble floor like chimes in a sudden breeze. "This bank is mine." For a heartbeat, the world hung suspended. Then the laughter crashed back louder than before, sharp and incredulous. A trio of uniformed tellers leaned forward, exchanging amused glances. A woman in a designer suit clutched her child's hand and whispered to her companion, "Is he serious?" Even the brass plaque behind the counter seemed to gleam with mockery. Elijah didn't flinch. He remained still, silver-haired and stooped by time, but with a presence far grander than his humble frame suggested. His frayed coat hung from narrow shoulders, and his canvas bag, worn nearly threadbare, rested at his feet. He offered no smile, no plea. Just that simple declaration repeated under his breath as if to affirm it for himself. "This bank is mine." Then, as if by instinct, the room stilled. The laughter dulled. Phones lowered. The soft hum of the overhead fluorescent lights grew audibly louder, as if the very air had thickened. Customers froze mid-gesture, their expressions shifting from amusement to uneasy curiosity. Even Stephen Miller, whose hand hovered at his holster, hesitated. Elijah moved forward each step, deliberate left foot, right foot, tapping the mosaic inlay near the teller line. He closed the distance to manager James Temp's desk, where Temp-tailored suit, immaculate hair swept back with precision, had momentarily lost his composure. The manager's eyes darted from Elijah's steady gaze to the ledgers stacked on his desk and back again. "Elijah C.K. Kirby," the old man said, pausing a half step from Temp's perch. "Founder and first president. This institution belongs to me." His voice bore no threat, only unwavering certainty. Temp cleared his throat, smoothing his tie as if to restore some measure of order. He leaned forward. "Mr. Kirby?" "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, words measured. "This bank, Chase, has been under the stewardship of the Matthews family for generations. You might be in the wrong branch." A rumble of scornful chuckles rose from the waiting area. A young man in a pressed blazer shot Elijah a pointed look and muttered, "He's insane." But Elijah did not waver. He reached down and lifted the leather-bound ledger from the edge of his bag, a battered tome, its cover cracked with age. He held it up, letting the overhead lights catch the faded gilt lettering, "Chase Bank Founders Ledger, 1948. The room leaned in, magnetized. "I carry proof," he said, opening the book to its brittle pages. Inked entries detailed the bank's earliest deposits. Board resolution signatures of its first directors, and there, undeniable in sprawling script, lay his name, Elijah C.K. Kirby. Silence crashed in around him. As heads turned to glimpse the ledger's contents, Temp's facade of control cracked. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. The tellers leaned forward, eyes widening. Customers exchanged looks of disbelief, some afraid it might be a hoax, others intrigued by the unfolding drama. At the periphery, Stephen Miller's scowl flickered. He swallowed his initial impulse to draw his weapon. Instead, he squared his shoulders and stepped closer, a living wall between Elijah and the stunned crowd. "That's a forgery," he barked. "Anyone could doctor old documents." Elijah's gaze shifted to the security guard, and for a brief moment the old man's tired eyes burned with intensity. If it were forged, why does the Matthews family never refute it? Why have they refused every challenge to its authenticity for 70 years? A murmur rippled through the lobby. Temp's gaze flicked to Miller as if seeking support, but his own voice faltered. Behind them, a cluster of executives in business attire lingered by the lobby's glass doors, their faces masks of polite fascination. One of them lifted a phone recording the confrontation. Elsie Carter, a young teller who'd watched Elijah's arrival with caution, stepped from her station. She held up her hand to quiet the still churning crowd. "Mr. Temp," she said, voice steady, "we need to investigate this. If what he says is true—" Her words hung unfinished. Temp's jaw clenched. He cleared his throat again. "We will review these documents," he said, nodding toward the ledger. "But please understand, any claim like this involves legal counsel board approval, regulatory scrutiny." Elijah closed the book with a soft thud that echoed in the hush. He let Miller retain his post at the ready. He didn't push. Instead, he tilted his head as though acknowledging the complexity of challenging power entrenched over decades. "I have already walked those corridors," he said quietly. "I have laid out every piece of evidence before judges, legislators, and shareholders. I have fought in courtrooms and been told that a black man has no place owning a bank. I know your rules." The color drained from many faces. Murmurs of civil rights and historical injustice swirled through the lobby. A gray-haired customer near the back pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. A father hushed his children who stared wide-eyed. Stephen Miller's fist loosened at his side. He glanced at Temp, then at the ledger. Temp shook his head, frustration etched in every line of his forehead. From the desk drawer, he summoned a slim binder of corporate bylaws, the one passed around for new hires. He flipped through its pages, searching for something to dismiss Elijah's claims. But as he rifled through those glossy sheets, a hush deepened. The ledger and Elijah's steadfast bearing had rendered dense corporate policy suddenly hollow. No pre-printed form could mask the weight of a man's life etched into yellowed pages. Finally, Temp closed the binder and looked up at Elijah. His voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Mr. Kirby, I cannot dismiss these documents. They appear genuine." He glanced at Miller, whose glare had softened into confusion. "But this is unprecedented. You'll have to wait here while we confirm their validity." Elijah inclined his head the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, but not quite a smile. He placed the ledger and binder neatly on the corner of Temp's desk, side by side. "I will wait," he said. For the truth, somewhere in the back, a cell phone shutter snapped. A ripple of online chatter would follow, but in that moment all remained hushed and breathless. The bank's gleaming counters and polished floors felt vulnerable, as if the very foundations were no longer certain. And Elijah Kirby, the old man who carried the weight of history in his bones, stood at the center of it all, neither pleading nor punishing, merely insisting that at long last power acknowledge its own forgotten legacy. The sudden hush that fell over the Chase Bank lobby after Elijah Kirby's declaration lasted barely a heartbeat before it was shattered by the sharp snap of disdain. Gerald Hayes, the operations manager whose tailored suit bore the crisp emblem of authority, stepped forward. His nose-lifted nostrils flaring with contempt as he loomed over the frail figure. "This ends now!" Hayes' hissed voice, a low rumble that echoed off the marble pillars. Behind him, the security guard James Stephen Miller shifted his weight hand, twitching toward the holster at his hip. It was as if they had rehearsed this moment, the patrician manager bullying the old man, the muscle ready to back him up. Elijah surveyed them both with calm, measured breathing. His bag rested by his feet, the leather straps worn smooth by decades of travel. He did not flinch. He did not step back. Instead, he unfolded himself to his full height, stooped but dignified, planting his feet firmly on the polished floor. In those moments, he was less a ragged visitor than a monument to something far older than the bank's glittering logo. Gerald Hayes raised a hand as though to swat away a bothersome insect. "Sir, you're trespassing," he declared, voice brittle with impatience. "You don't belong here." He reached for a pristine white slip of paper, an eviction notice, perhaps? Then paused, as if uncertain whether it would even matter. Behind him, Miller's scowl deepened. The guard's broad shoulders tensed. His fingers curled into a fist of authority. But Elijah did not flinch. He watched Hayes with a steely calm, unshaken by the manager's fury. The onlookers' tellers, in their crisp uniforms customers, clutching bank statements, shifted in their seats, caught between curiosity and unease. Their eyes flickered from Hayes's enraged face to Elijah's unyielding gaze. A river of breath wheezed through the lobby, as if the building itself were straining to hear Elijah's response. At last Elijah laid a gentle hand on his bag, then lifted it just enough to straighten the straps. "I stand on no trespassing," he said, voice soft but clear. "I stand on history." There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet assertion that rendered every mocking word useless. Miller took a step forward, jaw clenched as though testing the old man's resolve. But the lines on Elijah's face did not waver. His eyes held a glint of defiance that sent a shiver through the guard's confidence. History. Hayes spat the word like a curse. He leaned in so close the silver stubble on Elijah's chin caught in his glare. "There's no place for your brand of history in these corridors." The bank's automatic doors shuddered with a hiss as another customer tried to slip in unnoticed, only to go unnoticed no longer. Phones raised, cameras recorded. The tension rippled like a rising tide, pulling every spectator into its current. Elijah bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in gathering strength. He beckoned to his bag with a subtle nod, and the onlookers murmured in anticipation. What other proof could he possibly muster? A ledger had changed the atmosphere. What would his next move be? The moment stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Then with deliberate slowness, Elijah unhooked his bag from his wrist and swung it open. Faint creaks of worn leather whispered through the hush. He withdrew a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with brittle string. Each envelope bulged with musty pages sealed long ago. He laid one on the shining marble countertop, the paper's edges crackling like autumn leaves. The bank's overhead lights caught the brittle paper illuminating handwriting so fine and deliberate it seemed engraved. All laughter died in the theater of silent fascination that followed. Eyes widened to capture every detail, the bold script at the top, Kirby and Williams' founding documents, 1948. The well-worn stamp imprint, the seal of an era when promises were inked in letters, not digital signatures. Hayes's shoulders slumped, the manager's mask of superiority, cracking. Miller's hand drifted away from the holster, uncertainty flickering across his features. Elijah C.K. Kirby. The old man repeated voice, hushed but weighty. He traced a trembling finger along a faded line. Be it remembered that on this day, the sum of $20,000 was pledged for the establishment of a banking house in the town of Rockview. His finger paused at the signature, his signature flowing elegantly across the bottom of the page. The lobby held its collective breath. Hayes swallowed against the dryness in his throat, eyes fixed on the yellowing text that unraveled the narrative of his institution. Every mocking quip he had unleashed days before, every impatient bark of dismissal, it all rang hollow against the undeniable truth inked in those ancient lines. But Elijah did not gloat. He rose the envelope so the entire bank could see the faded seal of legitimacy. He lifted his chin, meeting each skeptic's gaze until the room met his steadfast eyes. "This is not a trespass," he said, voice unyielding. "It is a reckoning." A murmur spread low and swift through the marble canyon. Employees leaned forward from behind teller screens, customers leaned over balconies in the mezzanine, and even the security cameras seemed to swivel. Authenticity was a force of nature. It uproots blind mockery and scatters it like chaff in the wind. Hayes cleared his throat, trembling. When he spoke, his words were measured and small. We will review these documents," he said, voice barely above a whisper. You have every right to present your case. Elijah closed his bag and straightened the straps. No victory danced in his eyes, only the calm knowledge that at long last the ledger had spoken more loudly than any jeer or threat. He nodded once, settling the world back into balance. As the operations manager turned away to summon legal counsel, and Miller exhaled a defeated groan, the lobby exhaled with them. Phones lowered, whispers subsided, and the fluorescent lights hummed a tired but hopeful note. Elijah Kirby, once dismissed as a ragged fool, stood at the heart of the bank's memory, unyielding, dignified, and finally free to let hidden history shine. The lobby seemed to inhale as Elijah's gnarled fingers worked the frayed leather laces of his sack. Every eye in the room, from the towering security guard to the murmuring customers, was locked on the old man's deliberate movements. The pattern of chipped marble beneath him, shadows from arched windows, lines of grout, like city streets, felt suspended in time, holding its breath. Elijah drew a deep, steadying breath, the creases around his eyes softening with memories older than most of the people around him. With a slow, practiced motion, he eased the drawstring free. The canvas bag sagged open, revealing its hidden cargo bundles of bills, edges yellowed as parchment, each envelope tightly bound with brittle string. Instinctively, the tellers in their crisp uniforms leaned forward, tips of their pens halted in midair. The security guard, whose stance had been menacing just moments before, froze as though he'd been struck by the hush. A single bill slipped from the top of the stack, fluttering like a wounded bird onto the gleaming floor. It landed with a soft clack, punctuating the silence with startling clarity. Slowly, Elijah reached down and picked it up. He held it between two trembling fingertips, angling it so the afternoon light from the tall windows caught the faded emblem embossed at its center, the initials CB interwoven in stylized scrollwork bracketed by the date, 1948. A handful of others bore the same mark, proof that these were no ordinary bills but artifacts of a bygone era. Elijah turned the note this way and that, letting the gathered crowd decipher for themselves the significance of the emblem. He could feel their collective heartbeat quicken, the quiet thrum of wonder mingled with an undercurrent of fear. Faces that had once sneered now mirrored uncertainty. The bank's rigid authority, the polished manager, the silent security, had been undermined by a weathered piece of paper. With solemn care, Elijah retrieved more bills, stacking them gently on the floor beside the first. Each bundle was clearly labeled in spidery handwriting, Chase Bank Currency Founders Reserve Series A. He peeled back one bundle's string, letting the bills fan out across the marble in a golden arc. The soft rustle of paper against stone was the only sound as those present watched in rapt attention. Caught between reverence and disbelief, some reached for phones capturing images of the uncanny spectacle. Others stood rooted, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. All the while, Elijah remained the calm eye at the center of a storm, his posture unbowed, his purpose unshaken. He knelt slowly, collecting a single note and pressing it to his chest as if it were a relic of a lost dream. Then he stood and his voice broke the spell, a low, resonant tone that carried through the hall. "These bills were issued by my hand," he said, voice unwavering. "They were the first currency of this institution. I funded its founding. I gave these people their first deposits, their first loans. Everything this place stands for began with this paper." At his words, the bank manager, who had stood back in shock, finally forced himself forward. James Tempest approached on unsteady legs, palms pressed against his sides, as though to steady his courage. "Mr. Kirby," he began, throat thick. These are authentic." Elijah met him across the unfamiliar gap between them. His eyes, black as river stones, held the same calm resolve they had when he first entered the bank. "You are welcome to verify every serial number," Elijah replied, "every signature. But know this, the truth does not require your permission to exist." A murmur rippled through the customers. Some clapped a hand over their mouths. Others exchanged glances that said, "How could we have been so blind?" The crisp uniforms of the tellers felt suddenly out of place in the face of these yellowed notes. Behind the counter, a young woman let her eyes blaze with curiosity as she watched one bill glide across the floor, carried by a hesitant breeze from the open doors. The security guard, who had been poised to throw Elijah out, shifted his weight, the tension draining from his broad shoulders. His fingers uncurled and the threat in his stance evaporated, as if banished by the newfound gravity of the moment. He looked to his partner, an unspoken question in his eyes. "What do we do now?" Tempest cleared his throat and swallowed hard. He reached down and gingerly picked up one of the bundles, lifting it with the awe one might reserve for a museum artifact. He turned it so the seal faced him, brow furrowed as he tried to reconcile the musty paper in his hands with the polished institution he had managed for years. These bear the original president's seal," he whispered, voice trembling. He traced the embossed letters with a finger as though trying to fingerprint proof of their authenticity. Elijah allowed himself a small, sad smile. "They do," he said, "and they carry the proof that this bank once belonged to all its founders, not just those who conspired to take it away." He tapped the stack at his feet. "These are not relics to be locked away," he continued. "They are reminders of a promise broken by greed and prejudice, but a promise that can still be honored if we choose to see the truth." The echo of his final words lingered soft and insistent. A hush fell again as though the bank itself contemplated the weight of his claim. In that suspended moment, the facade of marble and brass felt brittle, as though the entire building might crumble under the truth now laid bare. Then, as if on cue, the polished silence fractured. One of the tellers, a young man who had earlier whispered mockery, stepped forward, each footstep tentative on the cold floor. He bent to pick up a single bill, the edges brittle in his cautious grip. His eyes glistened as he traced the emblem. Without speaking, he turned to the customer beside him and passed it into their hands as though sharing a sacred artifact. One by one, those around Elijah began to do the same, bending, picking up bills, passing them along like torchlight in a dark cave. Each person who cradled the paper seemed to feel the tremor of history in their fingertips. No one wanted to tear away, but life must resume, so they worked backwards, gathering the notes into neat piles once more at Elijah's feet. They rearranged them respectfully, like sacred texts returned to a shrine. Elijah watched, silent and dignified. He let them collect the evidence with their own hands, knowing that no pronouncement he made could ever carry the same weight as the paper itself. In those folded edges, the collective memory of decades long past, emerged a ledger of dreams, an account of losses suffered in silence, a ledger that spoke of exclusion as deeply as inclusion. When the last bundle was returned to the bag, Elijah stood and closed it gently, the old leather sighing in relief. He straightened the straps over his shoulder, now heavier with proof than burden. He gave a simple nod to Tempest. No triumph in his gaze, only a quiet dignity that demanded restitution. In the aftermath, the lobby was transformed. Customers spoke in hushed tones, not of loans or interest rates, but of the man who dared to challenge the narrative of power. The uniformed tellers hovered near the counters, uncertain whether to serve or stand as witnesses. Managers and guards alike wore faces ashen with the realization that the past they relied upon had been built on a lie. Elijah paused by the main entrance, fingertips brushing the cool metal of the revolving door. It had won him the right to enter. Now it bore witness to his exit. He did not turn to watch them gather. He did not look for applause or acknowledgement. He simply walked out, each step as measured as its first, his silhouette framed by the sunlit threshold. Behind him, the sound of murmured astonishment rose. Phones buzzed with captured images and videos. Customers realized they had witnessed something profound, not a disturbance, but redemption of history. The bank's polished veneer had cracked, revealing the human ledger beneath. And as the doors whispered closed, the Chase Bank lobby lay in the stillness of upheaval, the old notes resting where they had been placed, a testament to the power of truth over time, prejudice, and power itself. The hush that had settled over the lobby after Elijah's currency reveal deepened when, with deliberate care, he reached back into his weathered canvas sack and drew out a second treasure, a brittle leather-bound ledger. Its once sturdy binding was frayed, the cover stained by decades of handling, yet the gold-embossed letters, though faded, still proclaimed Chase Bank Founders Record, 1948. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The security guard's tense posture slackened. The bank manager's polished composure cracked. Even the customers, some with shopping bags still clutched in hand, leaned forward, as though drawn by an unseen current. Phones lowered, pens paused, and the distant hum of the air conditioning faded into silence. All eyes followed Elijah as he laid the ledger on the marble floor, its weight insignificant next to the gravity it carried. Elijah knelt slowly, reverently, placing his gnarled hands on the yellowed pages. Each turn of the page was a small eruption of dusty history, handwritten entries in black ink, careful rows of numbers, signatures looping across the bottom of each sheet like an artist's flourish. Cracked spines bore witness to the countless times these pages had been turned, consulted, trusted until they were cruelly cast aside. He paused on the first page where the date June 12, 1948 was written in precise script. Beneath it, columns detailed deposits, expenditures, and the founding capital contributed by two men, Elijah C. Kirby and his partner John M. Williams. There, in careful flowing handwriting, was Elijah's own signature, followed by Williams's unmistakable scrawl. As Elijah gently traced the ink with a trembling fingertip, a murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. A bank teller, her station now unattended, stepped forward, eyes wide. She bent at the waist, studying the page as though scanning for a hidden message. Other employees joined her, crowding in, murmuring to one another. Patrons set down their cups of coffee, their cell phones forgotten in their hands, drawn to the unfolding revelation like moths to a flame. "Look here," one whispered near the central column, voice hushed but urgent. "This is the original list of investors." Another peered over a coworker's shoulder. "His name is right there, and here." Fingers pointed at Elijah's signature ink, still strong despite the decades. The room's collective heartbeat quickened, each reader experiencing a jolt of recognition. The bank's entire accepted narrative had just been undone by an old brittle document. Elijah rose to his feet, closing the ledger gently, as though it were a sacred text. He allowed himself a moment to meet the eyes of those nearest him, fearful, awed, uncertain. He cleared his throat, voice low, but carrying the authority of a man who had built something that everyone believed was theirs, but that he knew had been stolen. "This ledger is more than numbers," he told them. "It is the blueprint of my dream, our dream of what this institution could be. A dream forged in sweat and hope, not in privilege or prejudice." A chill breeze from the open entrance rustled the drapery at the bank's front, and with it came a ripple of reality, unvarnished truth in the face of polished lies. In response, some customers fumbled for coats, their laughter from earlier now replaced by tight-lipped frowns. A board of managers summoned behind tinted glass hesitated, uneasy with the knowledge that their carefully curated history was now in question. The bank manager, the man who had once dismissed Elijah as a nuisance, stepped forward at last. James Tempest's voice, steadier now, quavered between apology and indignation. "Mr. Kirby, He stopped, scanning the ledger with growing dread, each page a nail in the coffin of the story he had been paid to uphold. "I don't know what to say." Elijah's expression softened, not with triumph, but with the quiet regret of a man forced to uproot a lie so that justice might grow in its place. He knelt again to tuck the ledger back into its worn binding. "I'm not here to destroy," he said, voice rich with empathy. "I'm here to restore, to remind us all that what is built on injustice must be rebuilt on fairness." Across the marble floor, the security guard exhaled, knuckles unclenching. The gun at his side, once a symbol of unquestioned authority, now felt heavy and hollow. He adjusted his posture, no longer the aggressor, but a witness to the unspooling of buried history. Gradually, the tellers and patrons began to reclaim the scattered bundles of yellowed bills, stacking them with care beside the ledger. Each person who touched those notes felt the weight of Elijah's truth settle within them, uneasy, unsettling, yet undeniably real. Where once suspicion had hovered now, a tentative respect took root, fragile as new spring grass. Elijah slung his sack over his shoulder, the leather strap creaking in protest. He paused at the center of the lobby, surveying a scene transformed not by violence or spectacle, but by the simple, unrelenting power of evidence. The ledger and the bills had spoken where words might have faltered. Without a final flourish, Elijah turned toward the door. His silhouette, backlit by the afternoon sun, carried a regal dignity. He did not need applause or acknowledgement. The quiet stir of understanding in the bank's heart was reward enough. As he passed between the rows of stunned faces, customers and clerks alike stepped aside, creating a pathway lined not by mockery, but by the shared recognition of wrong finally made right. Once beyond the revolving doors, Elijah stopped. He glanced back at the grand entrance now, a threshold between an era of buried lies and the dawn of accountability. Then, with a nod of thanks to the empty bank, his bank, he continued down the sunlit street, ledger and legacy secured, leaving in his wake the promise of an institution reborn on the bedrock of truth. Elijah's revelation rippled through the lobby like a seismic wave, and in its wake, the two most powerful men in the room found themselves unmoored from the authority they had wielded so freely moments before. Stephen Miller, the security guard, whose broad shoulders had once filled the doorway like a human barrier, now stood rooted to the spot. His hand, which had rested confidently on the holster of his service weapon, trembled as he realized the gun at his side did not convey truth. It only masked insecurity. His hazel eyes, so used to scanning the crowd for troublemakers, now darted uncertainly from the brittle ledger in Elijah's grasp to the bank manager's ashen face, and then back to the trembling stack of yellowed bills that had spilled across the marble floor. He had never expected to witness an intruder quietly dismantle the very foundations of his command. Behind him, Manager James Tempest's polished composure cracked like thin ice under pressure. His tailored suit, once a symbol of pedigree and stability, now felt stifling as he stared at the faded signatures that bore witness to a history he had been complicit in burying. Tempest's mind raced the board's quarterly report, the carefully curated portrait of the Matthews family's lineage, the investor presentations, all of it, now stood exposed as a thin veneer over a darker truth. He could feel his throat tighten, not from anger, but from the sudden vertigo of moral responsibility. Around them, the teller station's immutable monoliths of protocol had become altars to accountability. Customers who had earlier clutched their purses in disdain now exchanged uneasy glances as though they too had glimpsed a fault line running beneath society's sleek surface. The chandelier overhead, once gleaming with institutional confidence, now shimmered like shards of fractured certainty. Elijah, standing in the eye of this storm, allowed neither triumph nor bitterness to cloud his gaze. He sensed the guard's struggle as palpably as if Stephen had confided it in whispers. He saw the manager's internal conflict in every tight line etched around Tempest's mouth, and quietly, with the dignity of a man who had waited decades for justice, he took a small, deliberate step toward the teller counter. "Gentlemen," Elijah said, voice calm yet resonant, "I know you're grappling with what this ledger and these notes mean, but I stand before you, not as a would-be disruptor, but as the man who built this institution on hope that it would serve all who sought its shelter, not just a privileged few." Stephen's hand slackened on the holster, and the gun, once an extension of his authority, fell to a loose dangle. He looked at Elijah, really looked, and saw a peer who had been denied peerage. Tempest. His jaw clenched, nodded ever so slightly, a silent concession that the truth before him could no longer be ignored. In that charged moment, the bank's true gatekeepers shifted from those who patrolled its floors to the ledger's unyielding testimony. Authority confronted by irrefutable evidence found itself humbled, its power recast in the service of a legacy long suppressed. And as the echoes of laughter and scorn dissolved into awed murmurs, the lobby became more than a place of transactions. It became hallowed ground for a reckoning long overdue. The hush that settled over Chase Bank's marble lobby felt profound, as if the air itself were paying its respects to a moment long overdue. For a heartbeat, Elijah Kirby remained at the epicenter of that stillness, his battered canvas bag slung at his side, the 1948 ledger held gently against his chest. Then, as if time had shifted on its axis, a slender young hand emerged from the crowd. It belonged to Megan Carter, the teller who'd reserved her judgment throughout the ordeal. Earlier, she'd watched with widening eyes as her colleagues flitted between contempt and curiosity. Now she took a step forward, her black pump heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and retrieved from the counter a single ragged bill from one of the scattered stacks. With a deliberate slowness, she folded it neatly, then placed it beside Elijah's open ledger. A collective intake of breath followed. The bill, a torn, yellowed fragment stamped with that old Chase seal, seemed in Megan's grasp to become a votive offering to the truth Elijah had unearthed. No fanfare accompanied her gesture. There was only the quiet authority of someone saying without words, "I believe you." Elijah glanced at Megan, gratitude lighting his eyes before offering her a gentle nod. Then something remarkable happened. The invisible barrier that had once divided bank staff from their distinguished clientele began to crumble. One by one, employees who had earlier averted their gazes or clutched their ledgers in alarm moved forward. A young man in a sharp pinstripe suit who'd sat behind the wealth management desk hesitated briefly, then knelt to reverently lay a crisp, unsigned bill next to Megan's offering. A pair of tellers, jewel-toned name tags gleaming, stepped out from behind their stations, placing their own faded notes on the floor as though building a mosaic in tribute to Elijah's legacy. Silence reigned, but it swelled with meaning. No whispered counsel, no overt instructions, just the steady rhythm of footsteps advancing on marble, of hands laying down paper evidence of a shared conviction. Even customers once perched in the ornate waiting chairs rose and drifted forward, their initial wariness replaced by participation in something greater than their daily routines. A mother leaned forward, guiding her curious child's hand to touch the edge of a bill, as though imparting a lesson in dignity that transcended age. As the circle of solidarity widened, the bank's original gatekeepers, Manager Tempest and Security Chief Miller, stood at its threshold, senses overwhelmed. Tempest's crisp new suit seemed suddenly out of place amid the gathering of tattered currency. His posture, which only moments before had been erect with authority, now slumped with the realization that power could not stand apart from principle. Miller, his holster abandoned at his side, folded his arms and allowed his shoulders to droop, the badge on his chest, heavy with an unspoken shame. Elijah, watching this transformation, felt a pang in his chest, part sorrow for the struggle of decades, part hope for what was unfolding now. In that moment of communal witness, the bank's cavernous lobby had shifted from a temple of exclusion to a forum of reconciliation. The sickly odor of polished brass and stale coffee gave way to something bracing and elemental, the scent of shared purpose. One by one, faces lit up with quiet resolve. There was Karen from compliance, her pin-straight hair trembling as she laid down a bill with immaculate precision. The loan officer who'd earlier tutted at Elijah's ragged attire, now bending respectfully to join the silent assembly. Each act of placing a torn note beside the ledger felt like a vow. They would not let his struggle or their own complicity be forgotten. As the circle completed itself, Elijah rose taller, though his frame remained stooped from age. He extended his gnarled hand, palm open to the gathering, and spoke in a voice that trembled not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment. "Your silence spoke volumes," he said, emotion catching at the back of his throat. "You have chosen to honor truth over convenience, to uphold justice over comfort. For more than 50 years I walked this earth branded a fool for claiming what was mine. Today you have reclaimed not only my legacy, but your own integrity." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the circle's soft exhalations, almost prayers acknowledging the depth of what had transpired. Tempest swallowed hard, stepping forward to stand beside Elijah. In that alliance of former adversaries, the final barricade dissolved. The manager voice, low but steady, offered a simple apology. "I'm truly sorry." Without ceremony, he placed his own tattered bill, worn at the edges from decades of storage, next to the ledger. Miller followed suit, removing his security cap. He lay down a faded note and stood at rigid attention, as if saluting an officer far above any rank his badge could confer. The gesture spoke of contrition and an earnest desire to do better. Around the lobby, technology that had once signaled cold efficiency, the beeps of ATMs, the blinking icons of digital tickers, fell silent. Humanity reasserted itself in the bowed heads of staff, in the gentle handshakes exchanged among strangers, in the child's bright-eyed wonder as he traced the old emblem on a crumpled bill. Outside the plate glass windows, East Coast sunlight glittered on a hush of sidewalks and streaming traffic, unaware that a quiet revolution had taken place within. Inside Chase Bank's polished columns and sweeping archways had borne witness to the revelation of a suppressed past and to the gathering of unlikely allies in a stand for what was right. Elijah closed the ledger tenderly and returned it to his bag, his heart full. Beside him, the tapestry of yellowed currency, each note an emblem of solidarity, seemed to pulse with new life. The group spread out, not breaking apart, but forming a living chain that encircled the center of the lobby, affirming that the truth now belonged to them all. No one spoke of next steps. There was no hint of posturing or political grandstanding. In place of official statements, there was the communion of conscience. In place of archival files locked in corporate vaults, there stood the tangible proof of history, reclaimed and shared. And as Elijah Kirby lifted his weathered sack, offering a gentle smile to each person in turn, the bank's polished mirror facade reflected their faces back to them. Faces moved not by forced apology, but by the profound resonance of a truth long buried, now finally embraced. In that luminous hush power found its rightful home, not in gilded titles or ivory towers, but in the simple, unspoken communion of allies in silence. The hush rippling through Chase Bank's grand lobby was suddenly punctured by the firm, quavering tones of manager James Tempest. His crisp navy blazer, once the epitome of corporate command, now seemed an ill-fitting mantle for the weight he bore. Hands trembling, he stepped forward from the circle of staff and patrons that had gathered around Elijah Kirby's tattered bag and brittle ledger. Every eye in the room turned toward him, drawn by the unexpected shift the venerable guardian of Rockview's financial heart had just assumed the role of its moral compass. Tempest drew a long breath, his chest rising beneath the fabric of his shirt, as though the very pillars of the building pressed upon him. The polished marble floor reflected the halo of recessed lights above, casting faint, exaggerated halos around his feet. In that moment, the lobby felt both smaller and infinitely vast small, because the truth had collapsed the cavernous space into intimate proximity. Vast because the implications of what had unfolded threatened to ripple outward through banking halls and boardrooms far beyond Rockview. My friends, he began, his voice still hushed, but carrying an unmistakable tremor of resolve. We stand at a crossroads. Today we have borne witness to an injustice older than any of us, a history buried in shame that we can no longer ignore. His gaze flickered to the tattered currency arrayed around Elijah's ledger, each yellowed bill a silent testament to an erased life. I will not allow this bank to continue resting on lies or silence, while the man who built its foundations walks away unacknowledged. For a heartbeat, the lobby was motionless. Then a wave of exhalations rose, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, an exhale of collective realization that the complacency they'd accepted would no longer stand. Tempest found courage in that momentary communion of conscience. He squared his shoulders, letting the trembling in his hands abate under the steadiness of his own commitment. I am ordering, he said, each word deliberate, a full independent review of every document, every transfer, every board decision past and present. We will engage external auditors and historians. We will invite legal counsel from outside our usual circles. We will leave no ledger unturned, no testimony unheard. This bank, our bank, will confront its past with uncompromising integrity. Behind him, the polished brass of the high teller counters gleamed like stern sentinels, but even the gleam seemed to soften in the warmth of Tempest's vow. A faint flutter of movement rippled through the assembled employees. The loan officers, the customer service reps, the security team that just minutes before had bristled at Elijah's presence. Now they straightened backs, uncurled, as if the manager's words had freed them from a spell of doubt. At the front door, the revolving glass panels turned languidly in the afternoon light, shadows dancing across the floor. Customers who had edged toward the exits paused, some drawn back into the room by the magnetism of the moment. Others resigned to remain in silent solidarity. They too felt the pull of history shifting beneath their feet. Tempest's eyes locked once more on Elijah, whose stooped figure stood like a monument of resilience. The old man's face, lined by hardship, now bore the faintest trace of a grateful smile. No grand applause shattered the hush, only the soft shuffle of feet and the low, resonant hum of a community reawakening to its own responsibility. Make no mistake. Tempest's continued voice steadying into something firmer. This will not be easy. We will face legal challenges, reputational fallout, and perhaps even institutional resistance from those accustomed to the status quo. But I will stake my career and my honor on seeing this through. For Elijah Kirby, for every employee and customer of this bank, and for the future we claim to believe in, we will choose justice over convenience. A murmur of approval rose not in boisterous cheers, but in the quiet rustle of sleeves brushing against desks, the soft click of heels on marble. Security Chief Stephen Miller, who had only moments before threatened to call the police on Elijah, now stood with arms uncrossed, head bowed, in something approaching reverence. The hard-set lines of his face had softened. The glove of authority he'd brandished now lay discarded at his side. Manager Elijah said, stepping forward so that his voice resounded even without amplification, "Your words are more powerful than any contract. Thank you for having the courage to speak them." The ledger trembled in Tempest's hand as he reached to clasp Elijah's with a firm handshake, an unspoken pact between founder and steward. Across the room, the bank's digital ticker, once flashing stock updates and exchange rates, flickered to black, as though the building itself paused to participate. The tellers at their stations, formerly silent observers, exchanged glances before rising one by one, stepping into Tempest's orbit to pledge their cooperation. Even the plush chairs arranged for VIP clients stood vacant in respectful witness, their opulent upholstery a stark counterpoint to the ragged notes now adorning their polished arms. With his promise made, Tempest turned to address the crowd once more. Effective immediately, he declared, "We will form a Truth and Reconciliation Committee for this institution. It will include staff from every level of this bank, customers, local historians, and, of course, Mr. Kirby himself. We will establish a public archive and launch a community forum. And until the work is complete, we will operate with a transparency that our peers may find uncomfortable, but that you, our community, deserve." The manager's words, though carefully measured, felt like a surge of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Among the onlookers, whispered conversations swelled into emerging plans. "I have documents from my grandfather's era," a retired binder custodian murmured. "I'll bring them to the committee." A corporate client honored more by principle than profit nodded to a nearby banker. "Tell compliance I'll volunteer my time." Across the lobby, a jittery young recruit from the mailroom offered tentative support. I'll draft the community newsletter when you're ready." Tempest watched these ripples of engagement with a swelling pride that washed away his lingering fear. He had not only spoken truth to power, he had invited that power to bow before accountability. Now what remained was the arduous work of weaving this commitment into the bank's operations, rewriting training manuals, reconfiguring archival protocols, convening weekly forums, and ensuring that every teller guard and executive understood that respect and dignity were no longer optional. The security chief stepped forward, removing his cap and placing it reverently on his locker. "You have my word," Miller said, voice gravelly, "that I will protect this process, every document, every participant, until its conclusion." It was a solemn vow from the very person whose impatience had once threatened escalation, and it struck the assembled crowd with the full force of redemption. As Manager Tempest observed, he saw more than a single institution mending its wrongs. He witnessed a new ethos emerging. The bank's gleaming atrium, once a temple of profit and prestige, had become an agora of transparency and shared purpose. Its security cameras, which had monitored every move for potential threat, now served as silent witnesses to a promise of mutual oversight. The glass facade that had shielded executives from scrutiny now reflected a broader accountability. Tempest exhaled, the tension melting from his shoulders. In that moment, he understood that leadership was less about the titles on one's door and more about the willingness to stand alone if necessary in the face of deep-seated wrongs. He thought of the boardroom meetings awaiting him. Meetings where the Matthews family's legal team would press for dismissal, where shareholders would clamor for quiet settlements. But he also foresaw something greater, a precedent set not just in Rockview, but in banking halls nationwide that truth unearthed cannot be buried again. Elijah, now flanked by Megan Carter, and a growing coalition of allies, offered Tempest a respectful bow. Their disparate paths, the founder's exile and the manager's ascension, had converged in this lobby, forging a bridge between past injustice and future redemption. In the wavering afternoon light, their silhouettes merged briefly as if time itself acknowledged the imperative of continuity, the torch of integrity passing from one generation to the next. Then, without fanfare, the manager, clearing his throat, dismissed the assembly. "You may all return to your duties," he said, the echo of his promise still vibrating in the marble. "But remember, duty now includes truth. Let us build a new chapter together." The act of dismissal felt less like an ending and more like an invitation to the boardroom, to the conference rooms of external auditors, to community centers and local news outlets awaited across Rockview. It was an open door beckoning everyone to participate in the bank's metamorphosis. As colleagues drifted back to their stations, some to the ceremonial post by the teller line, others to the security desk they carried with them, the unspoken charge to verify every claim, to share every document, to listen without prejudice, and to treat every person who walked through those doors with the dignity that Manager Tempest had risked his career to affirm in his trembling voice. In the wake of his stand, the bank's culture began to ripple outward. Training sessions were suspended in favor of storytelling circles. The lobby's decorative foliage was complemented by community boards displaying archival photographs. Even the refreshment bar, once stocked with corporate brand bottled water, offered now a pot of locally roasted coffee, an unspoken nod to the homegrown roots they had rediscovered. Above it all, in a place of honor beside the polished reception desk, lay Elijah Kirby's original ledger and well-worn currency, now protected beneath a lucite case. Beneath that case stood a small plaque in tribute to truth and the courage to restore it. It remained for all to see, a permanent reminder that the most enduring capital is not measured in dollars, but in the integrity with which we steward our shared history. And so as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across polished stone, Chase Bank's doors stayed open. Not just to clientele, but to the promise of honest reckoning. In that luminous hush, Manager Tempest's decision had sparked a profound transformation, one that would echo not in legislative halls, but in the daily choices of every person who walked through these doors. Justice, he had declared, was worth every risk, and in that pledge lay the bank's rebirth. The late afternoon sun lingered on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow through the tall glass facade of the Chase Bank lobby. Outside, a soft breeze carried the scent of magnolia blossoms drifting in from the city's tree-lined streets. Inside, the polished marble floor still gleamed under the overhead lights, but it no longer felt cold or impersonal. The grand atrium, once a monument to profit and exclusivity, had in the space of a single afternoon transformed into a sanctuary of shared purpose and renewed integrity. At the revolving doors, Elijah Kirby paused, his weathered hand resting lightly on the smooth metal frame. The ledger and faded currency that had once tumbled onto this very floor now lay encased in lucite near the manager's desk, a permanent testament to justice reclaimed. For the first time in decades, Elijah's shoulders felt unburdened, his spine unbowed. The man who had once been erased from the bank's history was no longer invisible. His presence had reshaped the very foundation of an institution built on his sweat and vision. Behind him, through the wide windows that stretched 2 stories high, the city's bustle continued. Taxis honked, delivery trucks rumbled by, and pedestrians strolled along the sidewalks engrossed in their own lives. Yet here in this moment, suspended between day and dusk, time seemed to slow. Passers-by caught sight of Elijah's dignified figure framed against the sunlight and instinctively bowed their heads, offering a respect born of knowing he carried a truth more powerful than the glare of any spotlight. Inside the lobby, the employees moved with a new purpose. Tellers straightened their name tags, exchanging subtle nods of solidarity as they attended to customers. A line of patrons, once impatient and aloof, now waited quietly, their conversations hushed with a hint of reverence. Over by the customer lounge, soft chatter drifted around the newly installed community bulletin board, where photos from the day's events were pinned alongside archival images from the 1948 ledger. One photo captured Manager James Tempest standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah and the security chief Stephen Miller, all 3 men united in a gesture of reconciliation. Another showed a young teller, Emily Carter, placing her torn bill beside Elijah's ledger, her small act of solidarity immortalized in a single frame. At the front desk, Manager Tempest lingered, his gaze still fixed on the lucite case. He watched staff and customers move through the space, feeling a steady hum of optimism pulsing through every interaction. He remembered the moment his voice had wavered, yet carried the weight of conviction, pledging a comprehensive review, legal referrals, community forums, and utter transparency. He had known that uttering those words might cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his personal safety in the face of entrenched power. But as he scanned the faces around him, each reflecting relief, respect, or awe, he also recognized something he hadn't felt in years: unshakable pride in standing for what was right. Past the reception desks, Chief Security Officer Miller stood at ease, his gun holster empty, his arms uncrossed. He had once intended to forcibly remove Elijah from the premises. Now, he was the bank's most fervent guardian of the truth Elijah had revealed. Miller had quietly initiated a new security protocol, one that prioritized the dignity of every person who entered these doors. No longer would suspicion fall first on those who looked different or spoke unfamiliar languages. Instead, the bank's entry procedures now emphasized courtesy and cultural awareness training for every guard and teller. A hush fell over the lobby as the final customer of the day, a sharply dressed attorney, stepped forward to thank Elijah personally. "Mr. Kirby." She said, her voice gentle yet filled with emotion. "You've shown us that even the grandest institutions must bow to justice. I'll be filing pro bono paperwork to support the review committee." Elijah offered a warm smile, placing a reassuring hand on her forearm before stepping aside for her to exit. Each handshake, each murmured word of gratitude confirmed that his decision to walk away hadn't closed a chapter, it had opened one. As the revolving doors spun to admit a steady trickle of evening traffic, the lobby lights dimmed slightly, creating a cozy twilight ambiance. Bank employees moved to retrieve floor lamps, softening the environment further. Manager Tempest watched as a small group of customers gathered by the community bulletin board, their heads bent close together as they read the ledger's scanned pages and archival photographs. One elderly woman pointed at a signature E.K. Kirby, she murmured. Her companion nodded, eyes glistening. "He was real," she whispered. Away from the glass center, a cluster of the bank's senior executives convened in a private corner. For the first time, they were listening, truly listening to one another. A compliance officer, once steeped in rigid policy, admitted that the bank's document archiving system had ignored pre-1950 records. A marketing director acknowledged that the Matthews family's narrative had been presented without scrutiny, the bank's proud heritage built on a lie. They spoke in tones hushed yet urgent, aware that their decisions tonight would determine whether Chase Bank's rebirth would be genuine or merely performative. In the gleaming safety deposit hallway, silent except for the echo of footsteps, a lone custodian moved down the corridor. She was one of the late-night cleaning staff who'd witnessed Elijah's confrontation from a distance. Tonight she paused by the door of Manager Tempest's office and slipped inside. When the manager looked up, she met his gaze with a shy nod and pressed a single yellowed bill into his palm, the same design as Elijah's but clipped and corner-torn. "For your office," she said softly. He smiled, touched by her quiet courage. Back at the lobby's center, Elijah took one last look at the scene he had wrought. He saw genuine smiles, unguarded laughter, and the glimmer of hope in the eyes of hundreds who had once dismissed him as a derelict. The bank, he realized, was no longer a fortress of impersonal transactions. It had become a community hearth, its warmth fueled by shared accountability and respect. Stepping onto the sidewalk, Elijah felt the first cool breath of evening air brush his face. He adjusted the strap of his canvas bag, now nearly empty except for a few legal copies for safekeeping, and straightened his patched coat. As he walked away from the doors he had once owned, he no longer carried the weight of erased history on his shoulders. Instead, he bore the quiet satisfaction of redemption fulfilled. The city lights flickered on one by one, street lamps, neon signs, traffic signals, each glowing invitation to move forward. Elijah paused at the curb, watching the world speed by cyclists weaving through cars, pedestrians hurrying to evening engagements, a street vendor lighting the coals on his grill. In every direction, life pulsed with energy and possibility. Across the street, Tempest stepped onto the sidewalk, drawn by a sudden impulse to ensure Elijah's safe departure. He called out. Mr. Kirby. Elijah turned and their eyes met in a moment of mutual recognition. Tempest offered a small nod of respect, remaining on the bank's side of the street. Elijah returned the gesture, a respectful bow of his weathered head, and continued on his path into the dusk. As the two men stood apart, yet linked by the day's events, a single taxi pulled up to the curb behind Elijah. The driver, an immigrant from Senegal, rolled down the window and called out, "Need a ride, sir?" Elijah shook his head, offering a kind smile. "Thank you," he said, voice gentle. "I'll walk a while more." The driver shrugged and drove off, leaving Elijah alone under the amber glow of the street lamp. He set off down the sidewalk, each step confident and unhurried. In his mind, he replayed the day's revelations, the laughter that had fallen silent, the currency that had clattered the names that had reappeared in faded ink. He thought of the young teller who had stood by him in solidarity of Manager Tempest, whose courage had realigned the bank's moral compass of every once skeptical customer, now transformed into an ally of truth. Further up the block, a news crew had gathered by the bank's facade. Cameras framed the lucite case inside news tickers scrolling updates about the bank's promised review. Reporters whispered into microphones, speculating on boardroom repercussions, potential lawsuits, and the ripple effect on the national banking industry. But Elijah paid them no mind. He had no need for headlines. His mission had never been about notoriety. It had been about righting a centuries-old wrong. Ahead, the sidewalk curved toward a small park. Cherry blossom trees just beginning to bloom lined the path. Elijah stepped among their petals, letting a few pink blossoms settle on his coat. He inhaled the scent, a delicate promise of renewal, not just for himself, but for the institution he had reclaimed. In that simple act, walking under flowering branches, he felt the final seal on his victory, nature's own testament to rebirth. Evening deepened into night as he left the city's core and ventured toward quieter streets. Storefronts blinked off their lights, restaurant kitchens flushed with late-night orders, the distant hum of freeway traffic lulled. Yet Elijah's stride never faltered. He walked as one returning home after a long journey, each footstep resonating with the resolve that change, however slow, was now irrevocably set in motion. In the days that followed, Chase Bank would become a national case study in corporate reckoning. Community forums convened, historical documents were digitized, restitution commissions formed, and educational programs launched. Manager Tempest's pledge matured into policy. Every branch would maintain transparent archives. Diversity and inclusion officers took their posts, and the bank's charter was amended to enshrine respect and justice as core values. Stephen Miller taught bias awareness courses to fellow officers, while Emily Carter led storytelling workshops for local schools. The bank's customers' once mere account numbers became stakeholders in a living legacy. But none of that mattered in this singular moment as Elijah Kirby walked beneath the open sky. The tattered coat and frayed shoes bore witness to a life tempered by hardship, yet they also carried the quiet dignity of a man who had refused to relinquish his truth. His every breath felt braced by the knowledge that in reclaimed ownership, he had gifted more than a suit of legal documents. He had returned the soul of the bank to the hands it belonged in. By the time he reached his modest apartment at the edge of town, a simple brownstone with ivy creeping up its brick facade night had fully settled. He climbed the front steps and paused to look back up the street toward the gleaming lights of downtown. In their glow, he sensed a promise held aloft by countless hands that institutions, no matter their age or grandeur, could be reborn when people chose to champion truth over convenience. Inside, he placed his empty canvas bag on the sideboard. He stripped off the patched coat, draping it beside the worn ledger he carried at his heart. As he settled into an old leather armchair by the window, he closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of rare peace. Outside in the hush of the sleeping city, he heard the distant hum of life renewed. When he opened his eyes again, dawn felt close, even though the clock read midnight. Elijah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, boardroom disputes, endless press inquiries. But he also knew this immutable truth in reclaiming what was once taken from him. He had set in motion a dawn of restoration, not just for a bank, but for every person who walked its halls and for every community that believed in the power of justice. Outside his window, the first street lamp blinked off. In its place, the faintest glow of a star winked through a patch of cloud-streaked sky. In that quiet light, Elijah Kirby allowed himself the smallest smile. The night's journey had carried him full circle from erased founder to honored pioneer, from solitary claimant to shared champion. And as he drifted toward sleep, he carried with him the promise of many tomorrows, each built on the honesty he had so arduously restored, each illuminated by the steadfast glow of a dawn earned at last.